So X-Men 97 is the revival of the X-Men animated series that ran from 1992 to 1997. It was actually older shows like this that got me into comic books. Growing up, my sister and I were basically raised by television, and we would watch many cartoons with some of our favorites being superheroes. Spider-Man the animated series, Superman, Batman, X-Men, both the animated series and Evolution that came later. I knew that all these cartoons were based off of comic books, so I decided to check out the source material, and I've been hooked ever since. And I'm happy to see this show back in the public spotlight. Unfortunately, these revivals and remakes haven't had the best track record, and it's something I often cover on this channel, particularly shows from Mattel's Masters of the Universe franchise. But like with all these shows, I want to reserve my judgment for when it actually comes out. So far, I thought the trailer looked pretty good, and I think they did a good job at translating the old art style to this new format. I did see some issues with frame rates dropping, but overall the nostalgia is hitting pretty hard. That being said, I feel like oftentimes these shows will rely on nostalgia to get a guaranteed audience, but they don't really care that much about the original. We saw that with Revelation and Revolution, where they lured fans in with the promise that this would be a continuation of the original series, only to pull the rug out from under us. And now fans are worried that history will repeat itself. And again, that could very well be the case. We're going to have to wait and see what the show has to offer. I'm more concerned with the writing of the show. X-Men the Animated Series handled some pretty heavy topics, and they did it with class and grace. It can be kinda easy to fall into that trap of being heavy-handed and overly preachy when it comes to subjects like this. In the trailer, we see a loose newspaper flying around, and if you pause it, you can see Nature Girl, a mutant with horns. If you've been on this channel for a while, you might remember that we did a video on her back in the day. She was the protagonist of a comic called X-Men Green, which dealt with environmentalism, which is a great cause, but the way they go about it is very messed up. Where Nature Girl decides that the best way to handle the problem is to kill people, and Lynn is pretty out of character here too. It's like they didn't really care about her character at all and were just using her as a mouthpiece for their own views, and as some kind of wish fulfillment. You know, like a revenge fantasy. It's very clunky and doesn't reflect well on the character, but this comic is more indicative of the kinds of stories we're getting with X-Men recently. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of the X-Men after they moved to Krakoa. There seems to be a real lack of nuance, like with X-Men Green. The X-Men as a whole come off as more extremist. Not to the extent that we saw in Green, that was Nature Girl specifically, but still, sometimes I just straight up feel like the bad guys, and it just doesn't really feel like the X-Men anymore in my opinion, who are all about using their powers to help people regardless of whether they were mutants or humans. But here we're getting references to newer concepts of the X-Men. I think that one of the strongest points of X-Men the Animated Series was its writing, and since they're bringing back this show specifically, a lot of people are expecting that same level of quality, myself included, but the recent comics, in my opinion, haven't been able to recapture that magic. And while I'm hoping for the best, I'm still going to prepare for the worst. They are making changes to the characters. One notable thing that everyone on the internet is complaining about is that they changed Morph to be non-binary, when he was originally male in the show. And admittedly, I feel like they could just make a new character if they want to have that kind of representation. But there is this trope recently of making shape-shifting characters non-binary, and it kind of feels like they saw a shapeshifter and decided to play into that trope. X-Men shows will often add new characters, like X-23 started out in X-Men Evolution, and is now a beloved and prominent figure, so I don't see why they couldn't have done that again. People are also worried because they said that he would have an interesting buddy relationship with Wolverine, which they're taking to mean that they're going to ship them in this show. I have no idea if there's any evidence beyond this quote to confirm this, but I don't think anybody would want that. I don't want to make any assumptions, but I think the relationships were fine the way they were. So Marvel under Disney has given us some pretty great shows and movies. The MCU dominated the box office for well over a decade, but unfortunately these Disney properties have been slipping lately, both in ratings and in the box office. So hopefully Disney will be able to learn from its mistakes, so they can make the best possible show. One of my main complaints with the MCU right now is that nothing really feels connected anymore, along with the general poor quality of the stories. The MCU used to feel like it was building up to something, and what happened in one story would affect someone else's, but now it kind of feels disconnected. connected. And I've talked about this before, like how where WandaVision left off didn't really feel like it led naturally into Multiverse of Madness, or how the Eternals happened and then didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, only being briefly mentioned in a headline from She-Hulk. And now I can't help but question what was even the point of Eternals. What's really the point of any of this? There's a video on Twitter that went kind of viral, where many creatives behind these shows and movies admit that they A, aren't familiar with comics, and B, the writers aren't actually allowed to talk to each other or watch any of the other shows and movies.
First thing I was told is don't read the comics.
Really? As a creator, they put you in a bubble. They don't let you talk about any of the other projects, right?
Did you ever read you've never read the comic?
When the DVD comes out, I'm going to read a Thor comic book and just see where we went wrong.
Which helps contextualize how things have gotten so unclear. So I really hope that Disney treats this property better than they treated the MCU, especially since this is supposed to be the next season of an already existing show. We saw how well that turned out with Revelation. It would be really great to see Disney recapture the magic of the early MCU and have a really good Marvel show. Again, hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. And the final major complaint I've seen, and I can't believe I have to talk about this, is how defined Rogue's body is, particularly her butt, but they complain about her other assets too, and this is just silly. Let me explain. There's a shot in the X-Men 97 trailer that shows the cast fighting Sentinels, and we can see Rogue from the back. This is going to sound like I'm kidding, but a bunch of people zoomed in on that shot and saw that Rogue isn't the most toned down there. So now people are yelling about the culture war and women aren't allowed to be sexy and all of that fun stuff. And it's a betrayal of the original because Rogue was super hot and caked up in that show, which is misrepresenting the original, and we can see that because they're basically only pointing out one specific scene. In the original show, there's a scene where Rogue is being attacked by Apocalypse. She ends up on the ground, and the animation makes her double-cheeked up on a Thursday.
Cake.
So now multiple people on Twitter and YouTube are insisting that this is the way she has to be drawn at all times. In reality, this doesn't reflect the original show. The animation was very inconsistent, and characters would often go off model. Typically, Rogue was drawn like this. Sometimes they made her pretty flat, and sometimes they would make her more defined. It just depended on the scene, and that was true for the rest of the cast as well, regardless of their gender. But at no point in the rest of the show was she ever drawn this extreme. Don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with either of these depictions, but to make entire videos or dedicate major portion of videos to this complaint is so silly. Imagine if I did that with Nightwing. In the comics, they often emphasize how hot he is, particularly when it comes to his cake. They make it a point in the comics to bring attention to it, and they openly admit to doing this. I had a lot of issues with Young Justice later seasons, but imagine if I did a review of that show, but a major portion of the video was dedicated to me being upset that they don't constantly remind us that dick rhymes with thick, even though they do that in the comics. I would sound ridiculous. Dick is a sexy character. That doesn't mean he always has to be sexy or that they have to harp on it all the time. Same goes for Rogue. She's gorgeous regardless of how flat or thick the animators decide to make her in those frames. There are way bigger issues to be concerned about, and it wasn't even indicative of the original show. People need to calm down. Overall, people have been burned a lot before, so now everyone just seems to be expecting it to be bad. And it very well could be. I'm personally going to hold out and see what happens, but my expectations aren't the highest. Here's hoping to be pleasantly surprised. How do you feel about X-Men 97? Are you concerned? Excited? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to the members: Tyrant Carnivore, Shiny Orc Boy, General Bolivar, Depth Charge Media, Samaru163, Gabby Hime, Verdant Range, JVR, Nixel, Phil C, Taylor Ramirez, Caleb Nelson, Dakari the Professor, Equestron, Norman Sweetcream, Way Beyond Coincidence, Hunter Rose, 80s Nostalgia Guy, Felix Bam, Soundboy00, Lucas Geist, J Draws, Blue Spirits, Meowsers, Sky, Jinke Z, Philip, Stutania, Isaac Martinez, Garcia XV Legend, Datadyne Executive, Kitsune Fiora, Tobias Weller, and Bandito Bane. Thank you all so much for your support. If you'd like to become a member, you can hit the join button next to the subscribe button. We also have a Buy Me Coffee if you want to support us that way. If you enjoyed the video, you can leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content. And that part's free. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.